What's up, everybody? It's Charles. Today we are going to be replacing the worn out split control arm bushings on the R32. When I first got the R32, the rear bushings and the front control arms were completely trashed. So I went ahead and did all new bushings. When I did that, I did polyurethane both in the front and the rear of that control arm. Well, after about a year and a half, the polyurethane bushings actually started to split right in the center of the bushing where the metal sleeve goes in. Now, I did reach out to the company that made these bushings and they said they'd be happy to replace them, but what I want to do is try something a little different. So I'm actually going back to the OEM solid bushing that the R32 came with. Most of the rest of the Mark IV platform cars had a split bushing where there was channels cut out in it, but the R32 and the TT did have the solid one. So we're gonna go back to that and see how they perform versus these. Now I know you're thinking, Charles, we told you polyurethane bushings were terrible and they were gonna make your car blow up or something like that. Well, actually, out of all the cars I've had, a lot of them have had polyurethane bushings. This is the first somewhat failure I've ever experienced. And again, the company did offer to replace them for me, but I declined that because I did want to go back to the stock style solid bushings. So we're going to focus on the passenger side here for this one because it does have a little bit of extra special needs that the driver's side didn't. If you're doing this on some of the other Mark IV platform cars, 1.8 turbos with automatic transmissions, VR6s with any transmission, 2 liters with automatics, you are going to have to make a choice to either drop the subframe or lift the engine up so we can get that front bolt out. I personally like to drop the subframe. I think it's a little bit easier, especially up on a lift like this. If you're working on the ground, raising the engine up and unbolting the motor mount may actually be a little bit better. All right, wheel off first. Go ahead and install our wheel hanger. I'll put links to all the stuff that we're going to use today, of course, down in the description for you guys. Now I got the car up on the lift. If you're working on jack stands, make sure you have your car properly lifted, supported, and all that. If you want to learn how to do that, I did a video on that. I'll be sure to link up for you. There's really only a handful of bolts that we need to remove. We have 3 nuts for the control arm where it attaches to the ball joint, 1 bolt and 1 nut down at the back of the control arm, and 1 bolt at the front of the control arm. Now the R32 has a slot in the control arm, so the ball joint angle is actually adjustable, which means we really should get an alignment after taking these control arms out. In order to at least get it close, I'm gonna mark where the nuts are for the ball joint nut and the control arm. This will at least help me get them lined up pretty close to where they need to be. Probably not a bad idea to just go ahead and get the car aligned when we're done, but this will at least get us close. This is one place where I actually don't recommend using a paint pen, and I like a permanent marker better because the paint will actually bleed between the control arm and the nut, so it makes the mark a little bit wonky. Once those are marked, we can just go ahead and take those out. Pretty much all the hardware we're taking out today is one-time use, so you are going to want to replace these nuts. So now you can see our witness mark here where the nut was, and you can see actually how much adjustment we really have here. Next up, we're going to lower down the subframe. There are basically 6 bolts that we need to loosen or remove. I like to try and just loosen them if I can. We have 4 main ones that hold the subframe in, 2 at the front, 2 at the back. You'll need a 21mm socket for those. I like to start with just loosening them and see if that gives us enough clearance. If you end up with it coming out too far, just thread it back in a couple turns. Then we have the 2 bolts that go from the pendulum mount to the transmission. 16mm socket for this. The bolt we're trying to get clearance for is going to be right here. If we didn't drop the subframe, we would definitely hit the oil pan. Now that the subframe's loose, we can actually also move the engine a little bit, and this should be enough to get it out. If you have one of these wobble 18mm sockets works really well for this job. You can also do this by hand. You do want to be careful if you're using power tools that the socket doesn't bust off or get wonky on you, especially the wobble. You don't want to put a hole in your oil pan. That'll make for a bad day. This is also an area too that you want to be extra careful if your car's heavily oxidized. It's a good idea to hit everything with some penetrating oil before trying to take these out. This has been out about a year ago and this car doesn't have any rust on it, so it's not an issue for me. Just be aware that this could be a problem, and if the captive nut in the subframe breaks, you're gonna have a really bad day. Now see, it's hitting our oil pan just a little bit. I'm just gonna go ahead and take this bolt out the rest of the way, and probably the back one too. That'll give us enough room to get our bolt out. We are almost there. We only have our bolt at the back of the control arm left to remove. There's a nut at the top that's kind of hidden that we have to counterhold. One of these style offset wrenches works super good to get onto that nut. That gives us plenty of room to hold it and to loosen it from the bottom. If you don't have one of these cool offset wrenches, don't worry, you can still fit a regular wrench on there. This is just a little bit easier. So we'll set our wrench there, we'll get our 18mm socket, and we'll take this bolt out. Be careful with this one, sometimes water collects in it, and you get a face full of yuck water. Also, what I like to do is take the nut and put it on the bolt. That way we don't get our front bolt and our rear bolt mixed up. They are different lengths, so it would be kind of challenging, but this is just one extra precautionary step. All right, everything is unbolted. Now we can take our control arm out. Sometimes this goes really easy, other times it's kind of a struggle. The best way I've found to do it is to try and do the ball joint first. Pull down so that the studs of the ball joint aren't in the control arm. Rock it back so that our front bushing comes out. And then just wiggle it out for the back bushing. And you can see here our bushing was actually cracked in two spots, right there and right there. So we're gonna get this purple guy out and we're gonna get an OEM one back in. So we are out here in the dungeon. We're gonna get this bushing pressed out. Now, if this were an OEM bushing, it would actually be easier. We have bushing material on both sides of the control arm, which can make this a little bit more challenging. The good thing is this is the old bushing, so if we end up destroying it, it doesn't matter one bit. Now, if you don't have a press, you can go to like your local car parts store and rent one of the tools to do this with. This is probably the worst part of the whole job. If neither one of those are an option for you, you can also take the control arms out yourself and then take them to a shop and have them press new bushings in for you. Or you can even buy these fully loaded with bushings. So there's a lot of options. Don't worry if you don't have this kind of equipment. All right, after a few minutes of playing around with it, I think I got a setup that'll finally work. So we'll just go ahead and press this bushing all the way through. All right, well, it looks like the camera didn't record the epic explosion of the bushing coming out, but here you can see it tore our bushing apart, but who cares, we're replacing it. There's another good look at those two cracks. Looks like little devil horns on the bushing where it split while it was in the car. Here is our opening where our new bushing is gonna go. I like to take some emery cloth or something. This is a Scotch-Brite pad and clean it up a little bit. Both sides, get all that good and cleaned. Now there's actually two different edges on this control arm. There's like a chamfered edge and there's a flat edge, which goes at the bottom. Our new bushing needs to be flush on the chamfered edge, on the part that goes on the top. I also like to press it in from this side because it'll square up a little bit easier. The reason it's important to pay attention to that is actually the height of the bushing is smaller than the height of this control arm. Kind of see it right there. So we don't want to push it all the way in to the bottom, otherwise the bushing won't sit in the control arm properly. Now on the solid bushing, it's not as important as it is on the ones that are split, but there's actually a nub on the control arm that has to line up with a nub on the control arm bushing. These are solid, so it's not as big of a deal, but it's important on the ones that aren't. We also want to make sure that through the control arm, we have some opening. You can see this sticks down a little bit, so we don't want to just mash it on a flat surface, otherwise it can destroy our bushing. It's important that the bottom here, right here, is flat on whatever you're pressing it down onto. Otherwise, we could end up with this bushing getting a little crooked on us, and we don't want to do that. While these are pretty cheap, we don't want to have to buy a second one if we don't have to. Next, we'll get our press piece. This is a 1 3/4 inch socket. You want something that has an outside diameter of about 60 millimeters. That is a little bit smaller than our bushing. This is a little bit bigger than 60 millimeters, but it's actually going to work perfectly. Just like before, we're going to bring the press down so that there's just a little bit of tension on it and we can let go of everything. We'll do another final check to make sure it looks level and even. Then we'll go ahead and very slowly, very carefully press this guy in. While you're pressing it, you want to make sure that it's going in even, so don't get in a rush here, nice and slow. You can also use a couple of blocks of wood and a vise if you have that. That works okay too. All right, that looks pretty flush. Let's get it off of there and double check it. Here is that old poly bushing that we destroyed it, taking it out. Let's check our new bushing. Make sure that it's flush with the top side. Again, the top side is the side with the chamfer. Also, we know it's the top side because it doesn't have our witness marks from our bolt, both the ones that we drew and the ones that are already there. I already mentioned most of the hardware we're going to use is one-time use only. So we have 4 new nuts and 2 new bolts. One other thing I want to do while we have this control arm out is to clean and relubricate our front bushing. Normally I wouldn't do this. I'm only doing it because, well, we have it out. So we'll go ahead and remove our pin. We'll get all this old gross grease cleaned off, put some new fresh grease in. I'm also going to mark it. That way we can look for any kind of weird wear or anything on the bushing. This should hopefully come right out. There we go. So there's actually a little tiny chunk of that bushing missing right there. That shouldn't really impact anything. Take a look at all around the bushing where it rides in the control arm. Other than being a little dirty, looks pretty good. Clean that old grease out of there. We'll go ahead and do the other one. Looks pretty good. This one I don't see any issues with at all. We'll get our urethane bushing lubricant, relubricate this, get it all greased up. This is one of the keys to making poly not make noise. Let's keep it good and lubricated for this other one. And of course, our little pin that goes through. Lubricate that real nice. This stuff is goopy. Ugh. Look at how sticky that is. All right, that's it. We don't really need to worry about lubricating our back bushing. Go ahead and get it back in the car. All right, we got all of our new bushings in. Let's go ahead and clean up our subframe a little bit. Make sure there's no debris in there. We want to make sure that this surface here is free of debris. That way we get a good solid torque on our new bolts. Once we have everything all cleaned up, we can go ahead and install our control arm. Sometimes these drop in super easy. Other times they need a bit of persuasion. What I like to do is I like to start with the bushing in the front, right here, and get that just kind of installed. We'll worry about having it totally lined up once we get the backside in. Usually what ends up happening is I push this bushing in further than it needs to go and then pulling it back out. Grab a rubber mallet, make sure you use rubber, and tap it in. Okay, we're in a good spot there. Next, we'll get our rear bushing in. Usually I push up on the control arm, take our rubber mallet or a dead blow hammer, give that a tap in. Then what we'll do is we'll put our ball joint into the control arm. You may need to tap it up a little bit, but it should go in pretty smooth. Now you'll notice our control arm and our subframe, all this stuff is loose. If you want down here on the control arm, you can start these new nuts. That way the control arm doesn't pop out. Take a good look at these threads. If there's any kind of damage or issues, you're gonna wanna clean those up. Next up, we gotta line the holes up to put our bolts in. You can see this one's kind of offset. The control arm's actually too far into the subframe. We need to pry it back out. Now the bolt that goes here in the front, you can see our oil pan here. The bolt that goes up here in the front is the longer of the 2 new bolts that we're going to use. What we can do is we can just take our pry bar, very carefully pry that out. You may need to come down a little bit. Make sure you don't pry on the bushing, only on the metal. Line that up, get your bolt started. You may find that you need to pry it out or down a little bit more. And that's in. I like to start all these bolts by hand. Next, we're gonna do the same thing for our rear bushing mount. As you can see, our bottom hole's not lined up, so we're gonna get our pry bar and move the control arm out a little bit. Once your bottom hole is lined up, we actually need to line up the top side of that control arm bushing. So our bolt will go in, but it won't go all the way through. What I like to do is put the bolt in and hold it, take our dead blow hammer, tap the control arm a couple times. If it's being really stubborn, you can gently tap on the bolt to send it through. Just want to be careful because we don't want to damage the threads. And of course, we'll take our new nut, get that started on the top. And just like we did when we were taking this apart, we'll get our offset wrench, set it up on top. Go ahead and tighten our bolt down. We can go ahead and tighten up this front bolt too. Next, let's get the subframe all the way back up so this isn't wiggling around on us while we torque everything down. I like to snug up the driver's side a little bit first. That's gonna make putting in the bolts for the passenger side easier, assuming that we had to remove them in the first place. These bolts also have a coating, so you're technically not supposed to use an impact. I've said it before, but you really should get your car aligned after doing this kind of suspension work. What we can do until we get our car aligned though, is line our bolts up back where they were, look for the witness marks, and make sure that we line them up. This may mean we have to shift the subframe a little bit in order to get them in their proper place. These bolts are supposed to be replaced, and if you do that, the torque spec is 100 Newton meters plus 90 degrees. I'm gonna lighten that up a little bit because these bolts have been reused, so I'm just gonna go to about 100 Newton meters. We'll be pulling the subframe back down to redo the bushings in it, and we'll get new bolts when we reinstall it. All right, the torque spec for both the front bolt and the rear bolt on the control arm where we just did the bushings is 70 Newton meters plus 90 degrees. Now you'll notice our torque wrench doesn't really fit in this spot. I'm gonna pry the engine forward a little bit and use a block of wood to hold it so we have room to access. For our 90, I'm gonna put a mark right at about 6 o'clock. And we'll use our ratcheting wrench here because it'll be a little bit easier. So we notice our mark is right by the 1 on the bolt, so I'm gonna follow the 1, and there's our 90 degrees. Our mark is right about there. Once we have our bigger bolts torqued down to 70 Newton meters plus 90 degrees, and of course marked to be sure that we did it, we have to torque the nuts that go to the ball joint. These are torqued to 75 Newton meters. Now, we marked them before taking them out, so we may have to fiddle with the hub and move it around a little bit to make sure that the new nuts line up where our marks are. If we don't do that, we can actually throw our alignment way off to the point where our ABS light comes on, traction control light comes on, and we create some sadness. 1, 2, and 3. We'll get our paint marks on there. Make sure that they don't move. To remember 100% sure that we torqued them. And of course, we're gonna do the same exact thing for the other side. And finally, we'll put our dog bone or pendulum mount bolts back in. The torque spec on these is 50 Newton meters. I'm not gonna tighten them down quite so much because I have this aftermarket bushing in the pendulum mount. All right, so that pretty much does it. We do want to do one final check and make sure we got everything torqued, and of course put our belly pan back on if we're running a belly pan. Also, wheels on, wheels torqued, then of course take the car on a test drive, make sure we don't have any abnormal noises or anything like that. For now, I'm actually gonna leave the wheels off because we're going to be replacing the brakes again on the R32, going back to factory brakes to do a little bit of testing on that versus the setup that I'm running versus the setup that I had before that. And of course, questions or comments, drop them down below. I'll put links to everything that we used today down in the description. Guys, thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you again next time. Bye.